Okay, continuing on from where we left off at this slide before, this is video 2. So food deprivation and overeating, this is that binge eating that was mentioned. Food insecurity can lead to a cycle of food deprivation and overeating, which can cause obesity. When food is scarce, people that face this miss meals, eat less, but then when the food becomes abundant, they tend to binge eat and overeat. And this pattern is associated with increased body fat and weight gain. So the neighborhood factor. Resources available in a neighborhood can contribute to both food insecurity and obesity. Low-income communities are less likely to have that full-service grocery store and farmers market that sell those nutritious, farm-to-table type foods, fresh from the vine. It's just a lot of overprocessed, packaged food that they see. A lot of fast food restaurants, corner stores, and such like that. So it's just kind of a lack of access. That's not their fault. They just don't have access to those nutritional foods. So kind of this food for thought, just caloric intake per person, a study that I found. This is kind of getting into that rural versus urban. This shows this has been studied since the early 90s and even more recently. And so it does show that it's closing the gap on the rural urban aspect. Before it was a bigger gap in caloric intake and less being in the rural areas and more in the urban. But it also shows that link between the economic divide of the poorest and the richest, that gap. So we see that gap is narrowing as well, just as that 1% becomes so much smaller than it used to be. So this isn't just an urban problem. It definitely does affect people in rural areas as well, more and more. Continuing on with the aspects of low-income neighborhoods and physical activity, the resources are just so much better in higher-income neighborhoods. They have more parks versus urban dense areas. You see in those urban areas that there's not those parks, green spaces, recreational facilities. So it does contribute to it makes it difficult to have a physically active lifestyle. So there's more evidence emerging that this food insecurity is associated with less physical activity and that perceived barrier. So for all those families that, everybody works and you get home at the end of a long day, and just not having that energy to be as physically active, and it does show that low-income populations engage in less physical activity and less physically fit than their higher-income peers, just given those environmental barriers and physical barriers that exist in these low-income communities. So, city versus country, who's healthier? Sorry, this is a little hard to see. It does show that there's, not as big of a gap, but those kids in urban areas do present a little bit higher with 36% versus the 25% below that are in the rural areas that are overweight. So just kind of looking, it's not a huge gap necessarily between those areas as much anymore as it used to be, but there is definitely a little bit higher link in those urban areas. They present with those higher numbers of obesity. So continuing on with the few opportunities for physical activity, looking again at those urban areas, there just may not be those kinds of places that people want to go in those low-income neighborhoods. So, it's not the green, open, pretty space. It's, trash and disrepair, noise, traffic, car fumes, and just those toxins instead. along with higher levels of crime and unsafe playground equipment, and just those safety concerns of, is this a safe place to be outside walking around, which is a huge concern for adults and children in those areas. And so they do tend to stay indoors and live a more sedentary lifestyle because of this, tend to just, go home to their apartments and watch TV and play video games. And so these populations in these areas do have a much greater risk for obesity, and they're less likely to participate in those kind of organized sports due to income and availability of those as well. And so that leads into income and its effects. Having a low income is the greatest risk factor for food insecurity that studies show. Income determines the availability to buy and access needed services, nutritious food, and those things. When those resources are limited, households have to choose between housing or transportation, healthcare, food costs, and other needs. So that small income has to be divided between those, and a lot of times putting a roof over the head and keeping the lights and heat on are obviously more important than eating a salad. So to make ends meet, they do tend to buy less expensive, high calorie and energy dense food instead of the costly, higher quality food, like shopping at Whole Foods, for instance, or things like that. So they just don't have that option. So this chart shows obesity rates by income. I thought it was pretty interesting. So you see a big gap between those that make $15,000, so that poverty level or less, and that's almost, that's up in the high 30s, and this is a little bit of an older study, a few years old, and as that decreases, as the income rate does increase. So it shows that, there's definitely that link between low income and obesity for the low income population. And this does have to do as well with transportation factors, can affect both of these. Having access to a vehicle is very important in determining whether a family can access affordable, nutritious food. If you're only nearby a gas station or a little city, like a little market, versus the bigger, grocery store chains that we see here, they just don't have access to those fruits and vegetables, and it's just they have access to just a lot of fast food, processed foods. So, and we know with lower income, a lot of times that's not an expense that they can incur. So, and it does affect whether or not they can, make it to the park or to the gym, and those factors to help them get to those places to help maintain a healthy lifestyle, to, go and drive to take a hike, or go to the ball field, for instance, and things like that. And so that does play into the earlier where they don't have access to they tend not to play the sports and out of school activities as well. So this I thought was pretty cool. Things that communities are doing to increase, to get the people moving is, things that, we probably don't think of, just simple things like sidewalks and crosswalks. When those are improved, people are more likely to be out on bike lanes. This shows that after an installation of a bike lane in New Orleans, the number of cyclists increased by 225%. That's huge. In Houston, number of kids that are walking or biking to school has increased by 125% after their school started the walking school bus program. They've been putting in different outdoor fitness equipment in different parks, and this has been really successful in LA, and that's increased by 46%. So I just thought this was a really neat way that communities are getting people out and moving. All right, when we get back, I will start on stress and mental health factors.